Mom thought he could replace Dad. She did not know what happened when doors closed. I was 16 when my world split in two. The first half was filled with the smell of engine oil and the sound of my father's voice explaining how bridges hold together even under pressure. My dad, Daniel Carter, was a civil engineer, the kind of man who left before sunrise to inspect construction sites, but always came home with a story to make me laugh. The second half of my life began the night his truck went over the side of a county bridge. The police called it a freak accident. The local paper ran the headline, "Local engineer dies in tragic crash." Everyone in our small Colorado town whispered that icy roads were to blame, though the pavement had been dry that night. I remember sitting in the back of the funeral home as the choir sang, staring at my mother's stiff shoulders. She barely cried. And then, barely months later, she introduced Victor Hale to me as if he had always belonged at our kitchen table. Victor was polished in a way my father never was. Tailored suits, a confident smile. Business cards embossed with gold letters that read, "Hale Construction." He shook the hands of every neighbor after the service, told them he would look after us as if he had been waiting for this role. People praised him for stepping in so quickly. But I remember feeling sick when he leaned toward my mother, resting a hand on the small of her back, as though my father's grave was just a formality. At first, I told myself grief makes people act strangely. Maybe Mom just needed someone to lean on. But 3 months after Dad's death, Victor was already moving his leather briefcase into our living room. The side of his shoes, lined neatly by the door where my father's boots used to stand, made my chest ache. Mom said it was a sign of stability that we should be grateful for a man so willing to take responsibility. What unsettled me most was how Victor looked at me. He studied me not as a child who had lost her father, but as a problem he needed to manage. His eyes lingered longer than they should have. When he told a joke at dinner, he watched me more closely than Mom, as though my reaction mattered most. And when neighbors dropped off casseroles, he introduced himself as my new dad with a pride that made my skin crawl. The first time he insisted I call him Dad, we were still in black from mourning. Mom smiled tightly, encouraging me, but I could not form the word. Something in me recoiled. It felt like betraying the memory of the man whose calloused hands once held mine steady while I learned to ride a bike. That night, I wrote in my journal, "For the first time since the crash, Dad is gone, and they want me to pretend he never existed." By summer, Victor's clothes hung in the closet beside my mother's. His cologne filled the hallway, masking the faint scent of Dad's old work jacket I had hidden in my room. People around town accepted the new arrangement with polite nods. To them, it looked like a family finding its footing after tragedy. To me, it felt like someone had replaced the locks on my house while I was still standing inside. I kept waiting for Mom to notice my unease, but whenever I voiced it, she brushed me aside with words like, "You are too sensitive," or "We need to move on." She clung to Victor as though his presence erased the debts left behind after Dad's death. She looked relieved when he paid for groceries, when he whispered about vacations we could never have afforded before. I wanted to scream that no amount of polished charm or expensive gifts could fill the silence my father had left. Instead, I swallowed my doubts because every time I opened my mouth, Victor's smile sharpened just enough to warn me. I told myself maybe I was imagining it. Maybe grief distorted everything. Yet the way he closed the door behind me at night, the way the latch clicked, told me otherwise. That was the beginning. The moment when I understood that the accident was only the first fracture and the real breaking would come later, hidden where no one else could see. The night my father died was supposed to be ordinary. He left for work before dinner, promising he would be home in time to help me study for my geometry test. He kissed my forehead, his calloused hand resting briefly on my shoulder, and told me not to worry about the bridge inspections because they were routine. I watched his truck disappear down the street, the taillights fading into the dusk. Hours later, blue and red flashes cut through my bedroom window, and my mother's phone rang with the kind of silence that breaks lives. They said his truck had veered off the county bridge, plunged into the ravine, and burst into flames. The police officer at our door called it a tragic accident. He said the brakes must have failed, that it was a freak mechanical issue no one could have predicted. My mother collapsed on the couch, her sobs jagged, but I remember standing frozen in the doorway, unable to move. The words "freak accident" echoed in my head until they no longer made sense. At the funeral, the church smelled of lilies and candle wax. I sat in the back, stiff in my black dress, while neighbors filled the pews, whispering about icy roads and dangerous curves. But the roads had been dry. The weather had been clear. I remembered checking the forecast that morning when I planned what to wear to school. There was no ice, no rain, not even a cloud. Yet no one questioned it. They just nodded when the sheriff spoke about faulty brakes and shook Victor Hale's hand when he appeared by my mother's side, as though he had always been there. That was what unsettled me most. I had never seen Victor before the crash, but suddenly he was everywhere. At the funeral, he wore a charcoal suit and stood close to my mother, guiding her through the reception line, introducing himself to people who had known me since I was born. He told them he was a family friend, that he had worked with Dad on community projects. But I knew all of Dad's friends. They came over for barbecues for Sunday football, for late-night debates about the Denver Broncos. Victor was not one of them. When I asked Mom later how she knew him, she said they had met at the hospital fundraising gala last year. Her answer was quick rehearsed, like she had been waiting for me to ask. She insisted Victor had been kind enough to help her navigate the bills, that he understood construction and knew how dangerous bridges could be. The way she said it made my skin crawl. A week after the funeral, I found myself replaying the details of that night. Dad's truck had been well maintained. He changed the oil himself every month, kept a log in the glove compartment of every inspection and repair. I had seen the pages filled with his neat handwriting dates and signatures from the garage. He was meticulous about safety, for his brakes to suddenly fail did not add up. I also could not shake the image of Victor at the crash site. I remembered seeing a dark sedan idling near the police barricade as I clung to my aunt's arm. The driver had stepped out briefly, tall and broad-shouldered, his hair slicked back. Later at the funeral, when Victor walked into the chapel, I realized it was the same silhouette. Nobody else seemed to notice. They were too focused on casseroles, condolences, and the yawning absence of my father. My mother accepted Victor's attention with an ease that unsettled me. He paid for the catering, arranged the headstone, even handled the insurance paperwork. People praised him for stepping up, but when he spoke to me, his tone carried something different. At the graveside, he leaned close and whispered, "Finally, we can move forward." The word "finally" hit me like a slap. What did he mean by that? Who says finally at a burial? I tried to tell Mom later that it was strange, but she waved me off, claiming I had misheard that grief made people hear things that were never said. Yet her eyes avoided mine, and I saw the faintest flicker of guilt. As weeks turned into months, Victor's presence grew. He came to dinner more often, his leather briefcase on the counter, his cologne replacing the faint scent of Dad's work jacket. Neighbors commented on how quickly Mom seemed to recover, how lucky she was to have found someone stable. They said it must be fate. I wanted to scream that fate had nothing to do with it, that it all felt orchestrated, timed too perfectly. I started writing down my doubts in the margins of my school notebooks. Dad's brakes maintained road dry, Victor present at sight, Mom too calm. I knew I sounded paranoid, but the more I wrote, the more convinced I became that the accident was not an accident at all. Still, I had no proof, only fragments of memory and a gnawing feeling in my chest. Every night before bed, I replayed the sound of Victor's voice at the graveside. Finally. The word clung to me like smoke refusing to fade. It was the first thread of suspicion, thin and fragile, but enough to keep me awake at night wondering if the man sitting at our dinner table had a hand in making me fatherless. 3 months after my father's death, Victor Hale's presence shifted from occasional visits to permanent occupation. At first, it was subtle. He left a jacket draped over the back of the dining chair, a toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom, a pair of polished shoes lined neatly by the door where Dad's steel-toed boots had once stood. My mother called it convenience, a temporary arrangement, while Victor helped her manage bills and repairs. But convenience quickly became permanence. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find Victor carrying boxes into the living room, heavy leather binders, framed certificates, and a clock that ticked with an arrogant rhythm. He announced cheerfully that he would be moving in, and Mom nodded with relief as if this solved every problem. I wanted to shout that this was still Dad's house, that his laughter had once filled these walls, but my voice felt small against the weight of Victor's smile. By the end of that week, Dad's belongings had been packed into cardboard boxes and shoved into the garage. The framed photographs of him in his safety vest standing proudly beside a completed bridge vanished from the hallway. In their place, Victor hung glossy pictures of corporate banquets and ribbon cuttings images where he stood in tailored suits, shaking hands with local politicians. It was as if he was rewriting the story of our home, erasing Daniel Carter and replacing him with Victor Hale. The first time he insisted I call him Dad was during dinner with neighbors. The table was set with wine glasses we had never used before, and Mom wore lipstick darker than I had ever seen. Victor carved the roast with theatrical precision, then looked at me and said, "Call me Dad, Maya." The neighbors laughed approvingly, clinking their glasses while my stomach twisted. I tried to force a smile, but no sound came out. My mother's eyes urged me silently. Her lips pressed tight in expectation. I lowered my gaze and stabbed at my food. That night in my journal, I wrote, "He is not my father. He never will be." Life under Victor's roof quickly grew regimented. He woke us at 6 with the bark of a drill sergeant announcing that discipline built character. He inspected my homework, criticized my posture at the table, even dictated how much food I should eat. One evening, when I reached for a second slice of bread, his hand shot out to stop me. 16 is when girls become women, he said softly, almost intimately, his eyes lingering too long. My skin crawled, but Mom chuckled nervously, mistaking his control for care. Victor's rules expanded beyond the dinner table. He demanded I text him when I arrived at school, when I left, when I walked home. He checked the length of my skirts, monitored my phone calls, and reminded me constantly that safety required vigilance. Yet the way his gaze lingered, the way his hand occasionally brushed my shoulder too deliberately, told me his vigilance had nothing to do with safety. He also began to shape the house in his image. The living room, once filled with my father's books on engineering, now displayed thick volumes on business strategy and real estate. The tools in the garage were replaced with gym equipment. He even rearranged the kitchen labeling cabinets with printed tags like an office supply room. My mother praised his efficiency, saying he brought order where chaos had ruled. But to me, it felt like he was laying claim to every corner, suffocating the memory of the man who had built our lives. The town accepted Victor quickly. He sponsored the high school football team donated to the church roof repair and charmed the mayor with promises of new construction contracts. People saw him as generous, successful a savior for a widow and her daughter. They never noticed how his smile hardened the moment the front door closed, how his footsteps echoed through the house like a threat. One evening I overheard him on the phone in his study. His voice was low but firm as he discussed contracts, inspections, and something about the accident report. The word accident caught my attention, sending a shiver through me. When I leaned closer, the floorboard creaked and he ended the call abruptly. He emerged with that sharp smile, asking if I was lost. I shook my head, retreating to my room where I wrote furiously in my journal, "He knows more than he admits." Each day my resentment grew, but so did my fear. When I failed to call him Dad in public, his hand would tighten around my shoulder, his grip leaving faint marks. When I rolled my eyes at his commands, he whispered threats under his breath, subtle enough that Mom never noticed. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, watched, judged, and managed like a project he needed to complete. By the end of the summer, it was clear that Victor was not simply replacing my father. He was dismantling him piece by piece, removing every trace until the world believed Daniel Carter had never existed. And the worst part was that my mother seemed grateful. She laughed at Victor's jokes, clung to his arm at church, and defended him when I protested. She said stability mattered more than sentiment, that Victor was giving us a future. But every time I heard the word stability, I thought of Dad's steady hands, the way he explained that bridges held because their foundations were strong. And I knew that whatever Victor was building in our home was not stability at all. It was control, carefully constructed and polished to look like care. I felt trapped, voiceless, waiting for the moment when the facade would finally crack and reveal what I already sensed: the danger behind Victor's charm. The first time Victor struck me, it happened so quickly I barely realized it was real until my cheek burned. We were in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening. He had given me a list of chores to finish after school, everything from sweeping the porch to reorganizing the pantry, and I had completed all but one because I had stayed late working on a science project. When he asked about the pantry and I admitted it was not done, his expression shifted from polite control to cold fury. Before I could step back, his hand lashed across my face. The sound echoed off the tiled walls. My mother stood frozen for a moment, spatula in hand, before forcing a weak smile and saying, "He is only disciplining you." My eyes stung with tears, but I bit them back, stunned not only by the slap, but by her refusal to defend me. That night, as I stared in the mirror at the faint red mark, I told myself it was a one-time thing, that maybe stress had made him snap. But deep down, I knew it was the beginning. Over the next weeks, the violence escalated in small increments disguised as correction. If I forgot to take my shoes off at the door, he gripped my arm until bruises bloomed beneath my sleeve. If I answered too quickly, he pushed me back against the counter with a force that left my ribs aching. He never raised his voice in front of neighbors or church members. To them, he was charming and attentive, a man saving a struggling family. Behind closed doors, his charm evaporated, replaced by cold discipline delivered through fists, belts, and sharp words. He insisted I call him Dad every time he punished me, repeating the word until my throat closed around it. When I refused, his hand tightened on the leather belt he now kept draped over a chair in his study. My mother remained in denial, convincing herself these were lessons. She said all fathers corrected their children, that I was dramatic, just like my father had been, always suspicious, always questioning. The betrayal cut deeper than the bruises. It felt as if she had chosen him over me, just as she had chosen him over the memory of Dad. One Saturday, Victor forced me into a workout routine he claimed would make me strong. He ordered me to run laps around the backyard while he timed me with a stopwatch. Every time I slowed, he barked that weakness was unacceptable, striking the back of my legs with the belt when I stumbled. By the time I collapsed on the grass, my lungs burning, my skin streaked with welts, he stood above me and whispered, "You are mine to shape now." I felt my stomach turn, not only from exhaustion, but from the realization that he saw me as clay, to mold, not as a human being. When the neighbors asked about the limp in my step at church, Victor chuckled and said, "Maya is clumsy, always tripping over herself." They nodded unconcerned, and Mom smiled tightly, avoiding my eyes. The complicity suffocated me. I realized then how alone I was inside that house. The violence was not always physical. He controlled my meals, limiting me to small portions, remarking that discipline extended to the body. He dictated my study schedule, ripping up assignments if they did not meet his impossible standards. He criticized my posture, the tone of my voice, even the way I looked at him. Every infraction carried a price, a shove, a belt strike, or hours forced to stand against the wall until my legs shook. At school, I wore long sleeves even in late summer to hide the bruises. Friends asked why I seemed distracted, why my laughter had disappeared, and I told them I was just tired. I could not risk telling anyone. Victor's threats lingered in my ears. Accidents happen all the time. Cars swerve. People fall. Do you want your mother to suffer another accident? The implication was clear. If I exposed him, he would hurt her. Maybe worse. That fear kept me silent. Yet the humiliation and powerlessness built inside me like pressure in a sealed pipe. Each night as I lay in bed listening to the creak of his footsteps outside my door, I pressed my hands together and prayed not for comfort, but for strength to survive. I thought of my father, of how he taught me that bridges held because each beam supported the other. I tried to imagine his voice steadying me, reminding me that I was stronger than I knew. But the reality was bruises that deepened each week, and a mother who refused to see them. By autumn, the violence had become routine, woven into the fabric of daily life. The slap in the kitchen had been the first crack in the surface, and now the cracks spread like spider webs across every corner of our home. I knew something had to break, and I feared it would be me. Victor's control tightened like a noose, each day another strand pulling me away from the outside world. It began with small restrictions. He announced that the internet distracted me from school and locked the router in his office. When I protested that I needed it for research, he said the library was better and that discipline meant earning privileges. Then he took my phone each night at 9 o'clock sharp, placing it on his nightstand as if my connection to friends and teachers belonged to him. I tried sneaking it back once, but the moment he caught me, his expression darkened. He gripped my wrist so hard I thought the bone would snap and whispered that trust was fragile, and I had just shattered mine. After that, the phone was gone during the day too. At school, I became the girl who was never online who missed group chats and project updates. My friends stopped inviting me to parties because I could never come. Victor claimed high school dances were unsafe and said good girls stayed home. On the night of the homecoming game, when classmates flooded social media with photos, I sat at the dining table under his watchful eye, forced to recite vocabulary words until my eyelids drooped. He said, repetition built memory, but what it built in me was despair. Soon he installed cameras in the hallways and living room. He called them security upgrades, but the red light blinking outside my bedroom door told me the truth. Privacy ceased to exist. Even at night, I felt the lens on me, an unblinking eye that stripped me bare. I learned to change clothes in the bathroom, to cry silently into my pillow. When I begged Mom to see how wrong it was, she brushed my hair and told me Victor only wanted to protect us. Protection had become her excuse for everything, her shield against reality. The more she leaned on him, the less she leaned on me. I overheard them one evening when they thought I was asleep. Mom thanked him for paying off debts and for buying the new house in the nicer neighborhood, a 2-story with a fresh coat of paint that felt sterile compared to the warmth of our old place. She said he had given her stability. I wanted to scream that stability should not feel like prison bars. The house smelled of new carpet and paint, but to me, it reeked of loss of Dad's memory buried under Victor's purchases. One night, I lingered outside Victor's office and caught fragments of his phone call. Words like contract inspection and accident filtered through the door. The word accident jolted me back to the night of my father's crash. My breath caught and the floorboard creaked beneath me. The door opened instantly, Victor's silhouette filling the frame. He stared down at me with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Lost Maya, he asked, his voice deceptively gentle. I stammered about looking for my notebook. His hand rested briefly on my shoulder, heavy with warning, before he sent me off to bed. That night, I wrote in my journal, "He knows something about Dad's accident. He is hiding it. The isolation was not only physical, but emotional. Victor manipulated conversations to make me doubt myself. When I questioned his rules, he accused me of being dramatic. When I cried, he said I was weak like my father. He whispered poison about Dad, claiming he was reckless and selfish, planting seeds meant to erode my memories. At first, I fought to hold on to the image of Dad's steady hands and warm laughter, but the constant barrage wore me down. I started wondering if maybe I had imagined his kindness, if perhaps Victor was right. That doubt felt like the cruelest violence of all. Teachers noticed the change. My grades slipped. I no longer volunteered in class or lingered after school. When Mrs. Johnson, my English teacher, asked if everything was okay at home, I forced a smile and lied. Victor's warnings haunted me. Accidents happen. Cars crash. People fall. I could not risk putting Mom in danger by speaking, so I carried the weight alone. Sundays became the worst. At church, Victor put his arm around Mom and me, the perfect family. He donated generously to the building fund, and the pastor praised his generosity from the pulpit. Congregants congratulated Mom on finding such a strong protector. I felt trapped in a theater where everyone applauded the villain. The applause thundered in my ears long after the service ended. By winter, the isolation was complete. I no longer had a phone, friends, or privacy. Even my thoughts felt monitored, as if Victor could hear the rhythm of my heartbeat and know when fear spiked. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the creak of the house and the hum of the cameras. Each sound reminded me that I was trapped behind doors that hid violence no one else could see. And yet beneath the fear, a seed of defiance began to grow. I clung to the belief that the truth about Dad's death was out there waiting to be uncovered. Victor's control might have cut me off from the world, but it also sharpened my resolve. If I could not escape yet, I would endure. I would wait. And when the chance came, I would expose him. The night everything inside me cracked began like any other, with Victor barking orders and my mother pretending not to hear. It was late autumn and the house smelled of damp leaves and cleaning chemicals. Victor had demanded that I scrub the basement floor because he claimed it smelled musty. I had just finished a pile of homework and begged for more time, but his eyes narrowed and he ordered me downstairs. The basement was a space I had always hated, dark and windowless, the air heavy with the scent of mold and rust. The single light bulb flickered weakly, and the concrete floor felt cold beneath my knees as I scrubbed. My arms ached, my knuckles raw from the rough brush. After an hour, he came down carrying a glass of bourbon, his footsteps echoing off the cement walls. He inspected my work with a sneer and told me it was sloppy. Before I could defend myself, he grabbed my arm and shoved me against the wall. The impact rattled my teeth. "You will learn obedience," he said, his voice thick with drink. He locked the basement door from the outside, leaving me alone in the dark. At first, I screamed and pounded on the door, but the walls swallowed my cries. My mother never came. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest, my breath clouding in the chill. Hours passed. I lost track of time, counting the drips from a leaking pipe until they blurred together. That night in the basement became my breaking point. I realized if I did not find a way to fight back, I would not survive him. To keep myself sane, I began whispering words into the darkness, recounting every detail of Victor's cruelty, as though someone was listening. The words felt like lifelines, proof that my story mattered. The next day, when he finally let me out, pretending it had been a lesson in gratitude, I staggered upstairs and collapsed on my bed. My body ached, but my mind raced. I needed a record, something tangible he could not erase with lies. I tore a notebook from my backpack and began to write. At first, the words spilled messily, my handwriting jagged from trembling hands. I recorded dates, times, descriptions of bruises, the exact phrases he used when he struck me. I wrote about the cameras, the isolation, the way he whispered that accidents happened. Each page became a shield, fragile yet vital. I hid the notebook under a loose floorboard, covering it with a rug. Every night after that, I added more entries. Writing gave me a sliver of control, a way to resist his attempt to erase me. Weeks later, another storm of violence struck. It was after dinner when I dared to ask if I could join a study group at school. His face hardened instantly. He said girls who wandered at night got into trouble. When I argued that it was for academics, his hand shot out, seizing my jaw until my teeth ground together. He dragged me toward the basement again, ignoring my pleas. This time, he pushed me down the stairs. I landed hard, pain radiating through my shoulder. He locked the door and left me there without food or water for a day. In the darkness, I promised myself I would never beg him again. That vow fueled me when I finally stumbled out. I added every detail to the notebook, including the bruises on my shoulder, sketching the outline of the marks in shaky pen. One afternoon, while dusting the living room under his orders, I overheard him on another call. He spoke of contracts inspectors and money moving quietly. Then his voice dropped lower as he said the word breaks. My heart raced. He was connected to my father's death. It was no longer suspicion, but near certainty. That night, I dreamed of Dad's truck, of the bridge, of the word, finally whispered at the funeral. The connections locked together like puzzle pieces. Victor had killed my father. The realization both shattered me and strengthened me. I knew then that my notebook was not enough. I would need help. But first, I had to endure his wrath one more time. The breaking point came during another violent episode. He accused me of lying about finishing a chore, and when I insisted I had, he lashed out with the belt. The pain burned across my back, but I refused to cry. My silence enraged him further. He shoved me to the ground, his boot pressing into my ribs. "You think you are stronger than me?" he hissed. "Remember what happened to your father. Accidents happen." My vision blurred, but I forced myself to memorize every word. When he left the room, I crawled to my notebook and wrote down the entire exchange, the pressure of his boot, the tone of his voice, the threat veiled in memory. That entry became the most important of all. The more violence he inflicted, the more determined I became. I began to observe his patterns carefully. I noticed how he always drank bourbon before his rages, how he made late-night calls in his study, how he checked the cameras obsessively. I used those gaps to steal moments of freedom. In the school library, I pretended to study, while instead I wrote expanded accounts of his abuse, copying them into another journal that I hid in my locker behind old textbooks. I knew one notebook could be destroyed, but two gave me hope. By the time winter came, my spirit felt battered but not broken. Each bruise became another line in my secret record, each threat another reason to survive. I looked in the mirror at the girl with hollow eyes and whispered that I would not let him win. My breaking point had transformed me. I was no longer just enduring, I was gathering strength. Behind closed doors, he tried to break me, but instead he forged my resolve. I vowed silently to my father's memory that I would expose Victor, that the man who thought he could erase Dad and control me would face the truth. And though I was still trapped in his house, still watched and beaten, I knew deep inside that the tide was beginning to turn. It was during one of my stolen moments at school that I thought of Uncle Ryan. He was my father's younger brother, a firefighter in the next town over, and he had always been the kind of man who showed up when you needed him most. After Dad's funeral, Victor had made sure Ryan drifted out of our lives, dismissing him as reckless and unreliable. But I remembered the warmth of his hugs and the way he slipped me butterscotch candies during long services at church. For months, I had been too afraid to reach out. Terrified Victor would find out, but after the basement punishment, I realized silence would kill me faster than his fists. I found Ryan's number scrawled inside an old address book buried in the kitchen junk drawer. My hands shook as I copied it into my notebook. The next day, I used the payphone outside the school cafeteria during lunch. The metal receiver was cold against my ear, my heart thundering as the line rang. On the third ring, his familiar gravelly voice answered. "Uncle Ryan, it's me." "Maya," I blurted, words tumbling over each other. For a moment, there was silence, then his voice softened with recognition. "Maya, sweetheart. Where are you? Are you safe?" Tears stung my eyes. I whispered quickly, telling him I needed help, that things at home were bad, that Victor was not who he seemed. I mentioned the notebook, the bruises, my suspicions about Dad's death. He told me to breathe, to slow down, and then he said the words I had been aching to hear. "You are not crazy, and you are not alone." He asked me to meet him the next afternoon at the public library. If anyone asked, he said he had seen me walking and offered a ride. His tone was calm, deliberate, the voice of a man used to emergencies. That night, I barely slept, the red glow of the hallway camera blinking outside my door. At school the next day, Victor grilled me about my schedule, asking who I would be with after classes. I lied, saying I had a group project, and prayed he would not call my teacher again. My legs shook as I walked to the library. Ryan was waiting in the parking lot in his old firehouse pickup, the red paint faded but clean. He looked older than I remembered, streaks of gray in his beard, but when he saw me, he smiled, the same reassuring smile I had known as a child. Inside the truck, I showed him photographs I had secretly taken of my bruises and pages from my notebook I had copied in the computer lab. His face darkened as he read, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He asked careful questions, not pushing too hard, but every answer made his jaw clench tighter. When I told him about Dad's accident and Victor's strange words at the funeral, he nodded slowly. "Your father had been looking into Victor's company," he said. "There were rumors about faulty materials, bribes, contracts rigged. He told me Dad had confided in him about a week before the crash that he thought Victor was dangerous." Hearing it confirmed my worst fears and at the same time gave me a surge of vindication. I was not imagining things. Ryan leaned closer and said firmly, "Maya, your dad didn't just die." He was silenced. The words sank into me like stones. For the first time, someone had voiced the thought that had haunted me since that night. We sat in silence for a moment, the air heavy with grief and determination. Ryan promised he would help me gather evidence that he knew people who could be trusted. He asked if I still had the original notebook. I told him it was hidden under the floorboard, and he nodded approvingly. "Smart," he said, "but we need more." He wanted witness statements, physical proof, anything that tied Victor to Dad's death and to the abuse. He told me not to confront Victor directly, to act normal, to keep writing everything down. Before I left, he handed me a small recorder, the kind firefighters used for notes. "If he threatens you, record it. If he confesses, we will have him." My hands trembled as I slipped it into my backpack. Walking back home, I felt a mix of terror and hope. For months, I had been trapped, silenced, erased, but now there was a plan, an ally, a crack of light in the suffocating dark. When I opened the front door, Victor was sitting at the table, his eyes scanning me like a searchlight. "Where were you?" he asked casually, too casually. My heart pounded as I repeated the lie about a group project. He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded as if filing the information away. I forced a smile, but inside I was screaming. That night, I pressed the recorder under my pillow, my notebook hidden beneath the floorboard, and whispered to myself that I was not alone anymore. Uncle Ryan was out there, and together we would uncover the truth. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that survival was possible, that one day Victor's power would shatter. After meeting Uncle Ryan, I felt both lighter and more terrified because once you know you are not imagining things, the danger becomes sharper and more real. We met in secret 3 more times over the next few weeks, always at the library, or sometimes at the edge of the firehouse parking lot where he said no one would look for a teenage girl talking to her uncle. Each time, he brought something new, another thread pulled loose from Victor's carefully woven mask. The first breakthrough came when Ryan tracked down an old friend of Dad's from the garage. He showed me a photocopy of a maintenance log proving the brakes on Dad's truck had been serviced only 3 days before the crash. The mechanic had even signed his name in blue ink. There was no way they could have failed so suddenly unless someone had tampered with them. Next, Ryan found a witness. A clerk at the gas station near the county bridge remembered Victor stopping there the night of the crash. He had bought a coffee and spent a long time in the parking lot on his phone before driving toward the bridge. The clerk thought nothing of it until Ryan showed up asking questions. His statement gave us a timeline that placed Victor at the scene. Meanwhile, I worked quietly at school. In the computer lab during lunch, I typed up copies of my journal entries and printed them to stash in my locker behind old textbooks. I also learned to use the small recorder Ryan had given me. I kept it hidden in the spine of a notebook, turning it on whenever Victor's temper flared. The first time I caught his voice, it was chilling. He accused me of laziness for not folding laundry perfectly and snapped, "Maybe you should have died with your father if you can't learn discipline." Hearing those words played back later made me shake, but it also filled me with a grim sense of power. For once, it was not just my word against his. The evidence piled slowly. Ryan discovered through a firefighter friend that the police report on Dad's crash contained strange omissions. There was no mention of skid marks on the road, no photographs of the brake line, only a rushed conclusion that the accident was caused by mechanical failure. It looked almost as if someone had pushed to close the case quickly. Ryan suspected Victor's influence, his money and connections reaching further than we realized. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous it became. Victor grew suspicious. He began searching my room, flipping through drawers and scattering my belongings. Once I came home to find my mattress pulled off the bed frame, my clothes dumped on the floor. He asked in that deceptively calm voice what I was hiding. I forced myself to shrug to act confused, while inside, panic roared. Thank God I had moved the recorder and extra journal pages to my locker days earlier. I wrote in my main notebook that night, "He suspects. Be careful." One afternoon, Ryan introduced me to Caroline, a woman who had worked as a bartender at the place where Dad sometimes met colleagues. She remembered Victor showing up several times in the weeks before the crash, always asking about Dad's schedule, pretending friendliness, but watching too closely. On the night of the crash, she recalled Victor ordering a whiskey neat, then disappearing for almost 15 minutes. Not long after that, the commotion started. She had even been the one to call 911. 911. Her hands still shook as she told us. Her testimony felt like another stone added to the foundation of our case. Piece by piece, the wall Victor had built around his lies was crumbling. At home, the violence intensified. Perhaps he sensed my growing resolve, or maybe his mask slipped more with each drink. One night, he accused me of rolling my eyes at him and dragged me into the living room, forcing me to kneel on the hardwood floor while he lectured for an hour. The recorder hidden in my pocket captured his words. "I took care of your father, and I can take care of you too. Nobody will believe a sulky teenager." The threat vibrated in the air. Later, I played it for Ryan, who clenched his fists until his knuckles whitened. "This is it," he said. "This is enough to raise questions. But we needed more than questions. We needed certainty." So Ryan went further. He contacted Brian, the manager of the bar. After some convincing, Brian remembered that when the police came to collect security footage, they only took the main camera feed from the entrance. But the bar had recently upgraded, and a backup hard drive in his office still held hallway footage from the night of the crash. Ryan nearly shook with excitement when he told me. Together, we sat in his living room as Brian plugged in the drive. The video was grainy but clear enough. The timestamps told the story. At 9:47 p.m., Victor entered the bathroom hallway. At 9:51, he emerged, straightening his shirt. At 9:52, Dad walked in. At 9:53, Dad stumbled back out, covered in blood, shouting for help. Victor had been alone in that hallway for 4 minutes before Dad arrived. It was enough time to sabotage the breaks, enough time to stage whatever had happened. Watching the footage made me sick to my stomach, but also filled me with a sense of vindication. We copied the files onto multiple flash drives and hid them in different places. I tucked one inside a hollowed-out textbook in my locker. Another Ryan kept in a fireproof safe at the station. The third we mailed to Dad's old lawyer with no return address. Still, Victor's shadow loomed large. He began following me more closely, insisting on driving me to school, picking me up, watching who I talked to. He even installed a camera in the hallway that pointed directly into my room since he had removed my door. The red light blinked like an evil eye. I felt constantly watched, constantly hunted. Yet even under his gaze, I held on to the knowledge that proof existed beyond his reach. The evidence was out there, and once it reached the right people, his empire of lies would collapse. Every night I whispered into the dark that Dad would not be forgotten, that his death would not be dismissed as a freak accident. I promised myself that no matter how much Victor tried to break me, I would hold on until justice came. And with Uncle Ryan beside me, the possibility of that justice felt closer than ever. The more evidence Ryan and I gathered, the more desperate I became for my mother to see the truth. But every attempt ended in walls of denial so thick they felt impossible to climb. One evening, after Victor had stormed out to take a call, I sat across from her at the kitchen table and slid my sleeve up to reveal a bruise so dark it looked like ink. Mom's eyes flickered for a moment, but then she sighed and said, "Maya, you bruise easily, you always have. You probably bumped into something." I wanted to scream, but my voice came out as a whisper. "He hits me. Mom, he hurts me." She stiffened her spine and shook her head. "Victor is strict, but he loves us. You are just being dramatic, like your father was always suspicious, never satisfied." The words stung worse than any belt lash. How could she take Victor's side so blindly? It was as if grief had hollowed her out, and Victor had filled the space with his poison. The blindness spread to every corner of her life. When neighbors hinted about the cameras or asked why I was never allowed at parties, she brushed it off with a smile. "Victor is protecting us," she would say. "He keeps us safe." To her, safety meant silence, obedience, and loyalty to the man who destroyed our family. One night, I overheard them talking in the living room. Victor's voice was low but sharp. "She needs to learn accidents happen, just like her father." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding. Mom's voice wavered. "You don't mean that, do you?" His reply was a chilling whisper. "I mean everything." Instead of running to me, she changed the subject, asking if he wanted more tea. I backed into my room, feeling the ground vanish beneath me. The betrayal ran so deep it almost broke me. I had always believed that if Mom knew the extent of his violence, she would choose me, but the truth was, she already knew, and she chose him anyway. My anger grew heavy inside me, a weight I could barely carry. The gaslighting became relentless. When I cried from pain, Victor told her I was faking it for attention. When I refused to call him Dad, he accused me of being ungrateful. He would cut my face roughly and whisper to her, "She needs firm hands or she'll end up like Daniel, weak and broken." And she nodded as if convinced. Every night I lay awake replaying her silence every time he struck me, every time his voice dripped with threats. She had been the one who kissed scraped knees when I was little, who braided my hair before school, and now she was the one letting this monster call himself my father. It was a betrayal layered on betrayal, the kind that eats into your bones. I began to question myself. Maybe I was too dramatic. Maybe my father had been paranoid. Maybe I deserved this. That was the cruelest part of Victor's hold. Not the bruises, but the doubts he planted like seeds that my mother watered with her silence. At church, she smiled brightly, clutching his arm, while people whispered about how strong she was after losing Daniel. No one noticed the way my hands shook or how I flinched at sudden noises. I wanted to stand up in the pew and shout the truth, but my throat locked every time. My journal became my only confidant. Page after page filled with confessions that no one in my house would believe. When Ryan read them, his face burned with fury, but he told me to stay strong, to keep recording, to hold on. The lowest moment came one Sunday evening. Victor accused me of talking back when I asked politely to visit the cemetery. He backhanded me so hard I fell against the counter, splitting my lip. Mom gasped, but did nothing. I looked at her through tears and blood and whispered, "Why won't you help me?" She turned away, saying softly, "He is helping you. You just don't see it yet." Something inside me cracked then. My hope that she would rescue me died in that moment. I realized I was on my own. The mother I had known was gone, swallowed by fear and dependence. From then on, I stopped begging her to see. I saved my words for Ryan, saved my strength for survival, and reminded myself that one day Victor's mask would slip and she would be forced to face the monster she had invited into our home. Until then, I bore the weight of her blindness as heavily as I bore the bruises on my skin. The night of the confession arrived with a storm rolling over the Colorado mountains and thunder that rattled the windows like warning drums. Rain pelted the roof while Victor paced the living room with a half-empty glass of bourbon in his hand, his mood darkening with every swallow. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, pretending not to notice the tension, but I felt it building like pressure in my chest. When I asked if I could go to my room, Victor barked that I would sit and listen because girls who think they are grown need lessons. His words slurred, but his steps were deliberate. He set his glass down on the table so hard it splashed amber across the wood and ordered me closer. I obeyed out of fear, my recorder hidden deep inside the belly of a stuffed bear tucked under my arm. I had clicked it on minutes earlier, praying it would capture every word. He began with accusations claiming I had embarrassed him at church by not smiling enough. Then his hand lashed out, striking my shoulder. I stumbled back, but he seized my arm, dragging me into the center of the room. His breath stank of alcohol and rage. "You think you're smarter than me," he hissed. "You think you can defy me." I stared at the carpet, forcing myself not to cry. His voice dropped to a low growl. "Do you know what happens to men who defy me, Maya? They end up like your father." My heart froze. I dared to look up. He smirked, satisfied by my reaction. "That's right," he said, drawing out each word like poison. I cut his brakes myself. I watched him go over that bridge. It was easy. Too easy. My knees buckled. The room spun, but I clutched the bear tighter, pressing the recorder to my chest. He continued his rant, confessing piece by piece. Daniel thought he could expose me, but I was 10 steps ahead. He thought honesty mattered. Honesty does not build empires. Fear does. Power does. He paced while speaking his shadow, stretching across the walls like a specter. He boasted about bribing an inspector to bury the report about the crash, about paying off an officer to close the case quickly. He laughed as he described watching my father's truck plunge into darkness. "Your father was weak," he sneered. "He didn't know how to control people. I do. I control everything." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face twisted with drunken pride. My hands shook, but I forced myself to remain still. Each word seared into me, but it was also proof undeniable. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper only I could hear. "If you ever tell anyone, remember accidents happen. Stairs are slippery. Cars swerve. Fires start." Just like that, he threatened me again, tying my fate to the same cruelty that had stolen my father. At that moment, my mother entered the room. She had come back from the kitchen to fetch her phone, but instead, she froze in the doorway. The color drained from her face as she heard the tail end of his sentence. Her eyes widened as she looked from his furious expression to my terrified one. For a heartbeat, silence reigned, broken only by the pounding storm. "What did you say, Victor?" she asked, her voice trembling. He turned sharply, startled, then tried to backtrack, claiming I had provoked him, that he was exaggerating to scare me straight. But the damage was done. She had heard enough. Her hand trembled as she set her phone on the counter. "Tell me you didn't touch Daniel's truck," she whispered. Victor's mask cracked. He laughed coldly. "You really are blind, Laura." "Of course I did. He was in my way, and now he's gone." He lifted his glass again and drank while my mother's knees gave out. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her mouth. Tears spilled down her cheeks as the truth finally pierced her denial. I watched her crumble the way I had crumbled so many times while he hurt me. For once, she was the one seeing without illusions. Victor misread her shock as weakness. He sneered at both of us, calling us pathetic, whining women who needed his control. But in that moment, something changed in my mother's eyes. She looked at me, really looked, and saw the bruises, the fear, the truth she had refused to face. Her tears turned to rage. She whispered my name, apology after apology tumbling out. I could barely breathe. Lightning lit up the room again as Victor raised his hand to strike me once more, but my mother stepped in front of me for the first time. "Don't touch her," she said, her voice breaking, yet firm. He laughed at her defiance, pushing her back, but the moment had shifted. She had heard his confession, and there was no taking it back. I felt my chest rise with hope as the bear in my arms continued to record. Every word was captured, every admission, every threat. It was the evidence Ryan had said we needed more than anything. Victor staggered toward the door, muttering that he was done for the night, but before leaving, he turned back with a final warning. "None of this matters. No one will believe a drunk confession. You are nothing without me." Then he slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. My mother collapsed, sobbing into her hands. I held the bear to my chest, feeling the recorder inside like a heartbeat. The storm outside raged on, but inside the storm had finally shifted. The man who had terrorized us had revealed himself completely, and there was no erasing it. I knelt beside my mother, whispering through tears, "We have proof now, Mom. We can stop him." She clutched me to her chest, sobbing apologies over and over. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of power, not just hope, but certainty. His confession had changed everything. The morning after Victor's drunken confession, the storm had passed, but inside our house, the air was heavier than ever. My mother's eyes were swollen from crying all night, and my body ached from where he had grabbed me, but beneath the exhaustion, there was a current of resolve. I had the recorder hidden inside my backpack, wrapped carefully in a sweatshirt, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Mom barely spoke over breakfast, only whispering that she was sorry again and again. But I told her there would be time for apologies later. Right now, we needed to act. When Victor left for work, I called Uncle Ryan from the bathroom with the faucet running to cover my voice. The moment I told him I had captured a confession, his voice sharpened with urgency. "Stay calm," he said. "Do not let him suspect. Bring the recorder to me tonight." I agreed and hung up just as Victor's car pulled back into the driveway. My heart nearly stopped, but he only came in to grab a file he had forgotten. His eyes swept over me and Mom suspiciously, but he left again with a curt warning about keeping the house clean. That evening, when he announced he had to attend a business dinner, I felt relief flood through me. The moment his car disappeared down the street, Ryan pulled into the driveway, his firehouse pickup rumbling softly. I ran into his arms, clutching the recorder. We sat at the kitchen table while I played the audio. Victor's voice filled the room thick with alcohol and arrogance, boasting about cutting Dad's brakes, paying off inspectors, and threatening us. Ryan's jaw tightened, his fists clenched, but he said nothing until the recording ended. Then he exhaled slowly and said, "This is it, Maya. This is the proof we needed." He made 3 copies that night, one for himself, one to deliver to the district attorney, and one hidden at the firehouse. He also told us to pack a small bag just in case. I could see the fear in Mom's eyes, but also a flicker of determination I had not seen in months. The next day, the police arrived with Ryan at their side. 2 detectives sat in our living room while I told my story slowly, carefully showing them the bruises that still lingered on my arms and legs. They listened without interrupting, their eyes hard but compassionate. When Ryan handed over the recorder, they played the confession right there in the room. The silence afterwards was thick until one detective finally said, "We will need formal statements, but this is more than enough to issue a warrant." They left with the evidence, promising to move quickly. That evening, Victor returned earlier than expected, his tie loose and his breath sharp with alcohol. He sensed something was different. He scanned the room, his gaze flicking from me to Mom to the quiet tension that clung to us. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm. Before I could answer, headlights filled the driveway and red and blue lights reflected off the windows. Victor turned toward the door just as officers burst inside. For a moment, he stood frozen, his face pale, then twisted with rage. "What is this?" he bellowed. The lead detective stepped forward. "Victor Hale, you are under arrest for the murder of Daniel Carter and for domestic assault." The words sliced through the air. Victor lunged toward me, but Ryan intercepted him, shoving him back as officers grabbed his arms. He fought violently, shouting curses and threats, but they forced him to the ground, handcuffs clicking around his wrists. Mom covered her mouth with shaking hands as neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching through the rain-streaked windows. The facade Victor had built collapsed in an instant. The man who sponsored football teams and donated to church funds was dragged out of our house in shackles while reporters' cameras flashed. That night, the news stations ran with the headline, "Construction Executive Arrested in Fatal Crash and Domestic Violence Case." His face filled every screen, his reputation shredded by the truth. At the police station, I gave another detailed statement. It was exhausting, reliving every bruise, every word, every night locked in the basement, but the detectives reassured me I was brave and that my testimony would ensure justice. They promised me Victor would never come near me again. Back at home, Mom collapsed onto the couch, whispering apology after apology. She admitted she had known things were wrong, but she had been too afraid, too dependent to face it. I wanted to scream at her, but I was too tired. I simply said, "It's over now." We sat in silence until dawn, the weight of months of terror finally lifting. In the weeks that followed, more evidence surfaced. The hard drive footage from the bar confirmed Victor's movements, the gas station clerk gave a sworn statement, and the inspector who had taken Victor's bribe confessed under pressure. The case against him grew ironclad. Ryan stood by us every step of the way, driving me to appointments, meeting with lawyers, making sure I felt safe. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt like someone was protecting me. Victor was denied bail and sat in jail awaiting trial, his empire of lies crumbling. Business partners cut ties. The mayor distanced himself, and neighbors who once praised him now whispered about how blind they had been. My mother filed for divorce almost immediately, reclaiming her name and beginning therapy. She told me she wanted to rebuild, but I knew it would take more than therapy to heal the damage her blindness had caused. As for me, I stayed with Ryan for several weeks, sleeping in his daughter's old room, where the walls were painted sky blue and smelled faintly of sawdust. Each night, I lay in bed exhausted but free, the blinking red light of cameras no longer haunting me. I could finally close my eyes without fear of footsteps outside my door. The day the official charges were announced, the district attorney held a press conference. They listed murder, conspiracy, domestic abuse, and fraud. The words echoed across television screens across town. For the first time, I felt like Dad's voice was being heard again, through me, through the evidence, through the truth. When I returned to school, whispers followed me, but this time I held my head high. I was not the broken girl anymore. I was the girl who survived and exposed the monster hiding behind charm. The months after Victor's arrest felt like stepping out of a cave into sunlight so bright it hurt my eyes. For the first time in over a year, the house no longer echoed with his heavy footsteps or his sharp voice. The silence was different now, not suffocating but healing. My mother and I moved out within weeks, packing boxes with trembling hands. She insisted on throwing away everything Victor had touched, from his polished shoes to the heavy clock that had once dominated our living room. The garbage bags piled high on the curb felt like an exorcism. I went to live with Uncle Ryan permanently, while Mom rented a small apartment across town. She said she needed space to heal, and I needed stability that only Ryan could provide. His house was warm and chaotic, with the smell of sawdust and the chatter of his 3 kids. For the first time in months, I laughed without fear of punishment. Ryan treated me not as a fragile victim, but as family, helping me with homework, cheering at my school events, and listening when the nightmares came back. Therapy became a regular part of my life. Dr. Collins, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, told me healing would come in layers. She helped me untangle the guilt I carried, the belief that I had somehow allowed Victor's cruelty. She reminded me over and over that survival was not weakness, but strength. Some days I believed her, other days the scars on my arms and memories of the basement whispered otherwise. But slowly the nightmares lessened, the flinches softened, and I began to feel whole again. My mother started therapy too. She confessed to me during one of our tentative visits that she had been blinded by fear and loneliness, that Victor's wealth and attention had filled a void she was too weak to face alone. I listened quietly, torn between anger and sympathy. Forgiveness did not come easily. I told her I needed time. She nodded through tears, promising she would wait as long as it took. Victor's trial drew near, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The recordings, my journal, the bruises, the witness statements, the bar footage, and the inspector's confession all wove a story that no defense could unravel. On the first day of trial, I sat in the courthouse beside Ryan, my hands trembling. When Victor was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, he no longer looked like the polished executive who had terrorized us. He looked small, diminished, but when his eyes flicked toward me, the same cold hatred burned there. I forced myself to meet his gaze, refusing to shrink. The trial stretched over weeks, but the verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. The judge's gavel echoed like thunder as Victor was sentenced to life without parole. The room buzzed with whispers, and the press scribbled furiously, but all I felt was a quiet release, like a breath I had been holding for too long finally exhaled. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked if I had anything to say. I looked into the cameras and said simply, "He tried to break me behind closed doors, but the truth set me free." Then I walked away, not looking back. Life did not become perfect overnight, but it became livable. At school, friends slowly returned, offering cautious smiles. Ashley, the girl who once sat beside me in chemistry, hugged me tight one morning and whispered, "I'm sorry we didn't see sooner." Teachers were gentler too, giving me space when I needed it, but also pushing me to find my footing again. I poured myself into studying criminal justice, determined to use my pain as fuel. I wanted to help others who were silenced by fear and dismissed by those they trusted. Ryan supported me every step of the way, proudly telling anyone who would listen that his niece was going to change the system. At home, I found joy in small things again. Sunday breakfasts with pancakes and too much syrup, movie nights with Ryan's kids, where we laughed until our stomachs hurt, even helping out at the firehouse, where the smell of smoke and metal reminded me of resilience. The anniversary of Dad's death was hard, but instead of drowning in grief, we honored him. Ryan organized a small gathering at the bridge where it had happened. We placed flowers and read aloud from my notebook, not the pages of abuse, but the ones about Dad, his laughter, his patience, his love for building things that lasted. It felt like reclaiming his story from the lies Victor had tried to spread. As for my mother, she kept visiting slowly, rebuilding a fragile bond. Some days I let her in, other days I kept my distance. Forgiveness was not a single act, but a process. I knew I might never trust her fully again, but I also knew she was trying. When I graduated high school with honors, she sat in the front row crying while Ryan clapped loud enough for the whole auditorium. I walked across the stage, my diploma in hand, and felt for the first time that I was stepping into a future not defined by Victor's shadow. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer owned me. That night, sitting on Ryan's porch watching fireflies with his kids curled up beside me, I whispered a promise to Dad. I would live. I would build a life stronger than the one Victor tried to steal, and I would fight for others who still lived behind closed doors. Because behind closed doors, he had tried to break me, but I had survived, and survival had turned into strength. The story was no longer just about loss, it was about rising.